Wishing on a Star is back in style thanks to Guillermo Del Toro's modern retelling of Pinocchio. Let's take a look at some of the differences between the new hit and the Disney classic. Since Pinocchio came out in 1940, yeah, that's over 80 years ago, it was slim pickings in the animation department. Things were 2D, flat color, or just bust back then. Now don't get me wrong, the animation is beautiful. The colors are vibrant, and it's got that wonderful Disney quality we've all come to know and love. But Guillermo Del Toro's Pinocchio uses a different kind of animation, stop motion. Since Pinocchio is never really a puppet in this film, and don't worry, we'll touch on that later, Guillermo Del Toro took the word puppet and made it his own. He wanted to focus on stop-motion animation as an art form, so every shot of Del Toro's Pinocchio is an individual still, taken of live-action figurines and edited together to make it look like they can move independently. It took multiple sizes of puppets, especially to make it possible for Pinocchio to interact with small characters like Cricket, but it's done so well in this film and brings audiences perfectly between that line of live action and animation. It also gives us the signature surrealism and haunting vibe that Del Toro's known for in his projects like Shape of Water, Nightmare Alley, and Pan's Labyrinth. Overall, we loved this change. Disney's original Pinocchio is best known for its iconic classic, When You Wish Upon a Star. There's tons of other songs too, though. Gepetto sings the first time he plays with Pinocchio. Jiminy Cricket sings for Pinocchio to give a little whistle whenever Pinocchio needs his conscience. Honest John has two songs with similar tunes, An Actor's Life for Me and Pleasure Isle for Me. Pinocchio also has his own song for when he performs on stage, I've Got No Strings. Overall, though, the songs are generally lighthearted. It's a kids' movie after all. Guillermo Del Toro's Pinocchio also has musical numbers, but they are totally different. For one, When You Wish Upon a Star is not featured, but that could be because the song's still in the Disney chokehold. Let's be honest here, it's a miracle that Del Toro was able to get access to the wooden boy at all. But anyway, the songs that are included in the film have much more Guillermo Del Toro-like undertones. Gepetto sings a bittersweet song about his son Carlo. We'll talk about him later on, don't worry. And when Pinocchio comes back to life, instead of singing a song about Jiminy Cricket being his guide, he sings a song trying to figure out what everything is. Pinocchio's stage performance song is different too, and sounds similar to Gepetto's song about Carlo from the beginning. And we can't forget the movie's main song, Ciao Papa. There's certainly no wishing on stars during that number, only tears. The original Pinocchio is pretty ambitious about the time period and setting. Jiminy Cricket describes the town where Gepetto lives as a quaint little village. Time period is not mentioned. Given the architecture and the names of the characters, Gepetto, Pinocchio, Stromboli, we can assume the film takes place somewhere in Italy, but it's never specified, only that it's a quaint little village. Disney was probably going for a timeless feel, and it definitely works. Guillermo Del Toro, on the other hand, actually turned the story of Pinocchio into a period piece. Almost immediately in the story, we're told that it takes place after the Great War, where Gepetto's son died in 1916 when he was 10. Many years pass after that, until we are in World War II, which is the time period of Del Toro's Pinocchio. The film makes direct mentions of Italy and its rather problematic stance on World War II. There's even a guy who wants to take Pinocchio to a youth camp for boys who will become soldiers. Again, we'll revisit that later. But Pinocchio even performs for Mussolini in his puppet act. Now, at any point, did we think that we'd be watching Mussolini fanfiction on Netflix? Absolutely not. Especially stop-motion animation Mussolini, voiced by Tom Kenny, who also plays SpongeBob.
It's me, SpongeBob.
But somehow, Guillermo Del Toro makes it work. Now let's revisit Gepetto's dead son Carlo. Or, well, not literally. Gepetto does that enough in Del Toro's Pinocchio, but we just gotta circle back to the topic. In Del Toro's Pinocchio, the film starts out with Gepetto living his best life in Italy with his adorable son Carlo. Carlo goes to school and helps his father at the church while he builds a wooden crucifix. The two of them are on the search for the perfect pine cone, which he eventually finds and shows Gepetto. But Carlo leaves it in the church. Has to go back in and, well, boom. Yeah, sorry, it's really hard to watch, but it's real. Carlo's name is probably a nod to the 1883 Pinocchio book's original author Carlo Collodi, but now we're just gushing about Guillermo del Toro's creativity. We've got important things to discuss here. Lightening things up a little bit. In the original Pinocchio, Gepetto never mentions a son. He wants Pinocchio to be a real boy just because it would be fun, not because he's mourning his son from decades ago. It makes less sense in the story, but more sense when you consider that, hey, this is a kid's movie. Del Toro's film is very much not. Now let's talk about the wooden puppet-shaped elephant in the room, Pinocchio's appearance. In the original Pinocchio, we see Gepetto make Pinocchio with love. He's beautifully crafted to look as real as possible. He's painted and practically sparkling by the time Geppetto's done with him. Gepetto is surprised when Pinocchio comes to life, but he's not scared. Pinocchio is cute, approachable if you will. In Del Toro's Pinocchio, it is a completely different story. Gepetto is drunk, like super drunk. I'm talking completely plastered. He chops down the tree that grew from that pine cone his son found before he died and makes a boy out of the wood. He doesn't paint it. He doesn't name it. He doesn't even add strings to make him a puppet. He basically just throws it together. When we see Pinocchio standing and moving for the first time, it's actually pretty frightening. No wonder Gepetto's so freaked out. Also, one of the most interesting details is that when Disney Pinocchio's nose grows, it sprouts branches with flowers and even a bird's nest. In Del Toro's version, his nose becomes a pine tree branch, pine cones and all. Since he's made out of a pine tree, it makes sense. It takes him back to his roots, literally. If you thought the differences between the original Pinocchio puppet and Del Toro's wooden boy were a lot, let's talk about Cricket, shall we? In both Del Toro's and Disney's Pinocchio, the story is narrated by a cricket who acts as Pinocchio's conscience. But beyond that, the roles have tons of differences. For one, the names. We all know Jiminy Cricket, obviously, but in Del Toro's Pinocchio, we have Sebastian J. Cricket. Does the J stand for Jiminy? Probably, but it's never specified. Also, there's the look of the two characters. Jiminy is green and pretty humanized. He has feet, he wears shoes and clothes. Sebastian J. Cricket is, well, much more cricket-like. He does not wear clothes, and his little twig legs couldn't possibly hold shoes. He is very much a bug, where Jiminy is much more like a little pal. The dynamics of their relationship are different too. Sure, Cricket is Pinocchio's conscience in both films, but in Del Toro's Pinocchio, Cricket originally lived inside Carlo's pine tree before Gepetto cut it down. So then he moved right inside Pinocchio's chest, where Pinocchio's heart should be. It's pretty good symbolism. Cricket even calls Pinocchio his house. In the original Pinocchio, Jiminy just kind of follows Pinocchio around and calls him Pinocchio. Huge difference. The biggest difference, though, is that Jiminy Cricket starts out happy to be Pinocchio's conscience. Sebastian J. Cricket has to be bribed with a wish that he hopes to use for a book deal, cause, yeah, he's also an author. The differences are everywhere. He uses the wish for something else, but we'll get there. On to one of the most effective changes between Disney's version and Del Toro's version, our villains. The original Pinocchio has two villains, Honest John and Stromboli. Honest John is a fox with a friend named Gideon, who's well, honestly, it's hard to tell, but he's probably a messed up cat. Honest John's main goal in life is making as much money as possible. He sells Pinocchio to another antagonist, Stromboli. Stromboli runs the circus where Pinocchio performs. He's a marionette performer, a big Italian dude who keeps Pinocchio in a cage and threatens to turn him into firewood so he doesn't leave the circus. The Blue Fairy saves Pinocchio from that situation, but we talked about that already. In Del Toro's Pinocchio, Honest John and Stromboli are combined into one person, Count Volpe. He's a circus runner who finds Pinocchio and tricks him into joining the circus using fame and money. Combining the two characters into one big antagonist makes room for some of the other villains that we'll talk about. It also doesn't go unnoticed that Count Volpe, while human, looks very fox-like. It's a nod to the original that we did not miss. Honest John and Count Volpe both have sidekicks. We talked a little about Gideon, the weird-looking cat who just kind of follows along with what Honest John wants. He doesn't really get a closing arc. He's as much of a side character as it gets. In Del Toro's Pinocchio, Count Volpe's sidekick is a monkey, which makes sense when you consider the fact that he's a circus owner. The monkey, Spazzatura, works at the circus, and actually befriends Pinocchio for the brief stint that Pinocchio stays there. When Pinocchio stands up to Count Volpe for the way he's treated Spazzatura, he earns a little loyalty from the monkey. In the end, Spazzatura actually becomes friends with Pinocchio, Gepetto, and Cricket. He lives out the rest of his life with them. The antagonist sidekick is a much bigger character in Del Toro's film. Spazzatura grows as a person. Well, he grows as a monkey, but same difference. In both the Disney original and Del Toro's retelling, Pinocchio goes off to a place that's primary purpose is turning him into something else. In the original Pinocchio, Honest John sells Pinocchio off to Pleasure Isle, where boys go to live out their fantasies of living every day as a holiday. It has a rough house, a tobacco row where they get unlimited tobacco, amusement park rides, a model home open for destruction, and a giant 8-ball building where they can play pool. It sounds kinda like paradise, and it totally would be. That is, if the boys did not get turned into donkeys and get sold to salt mines and circuses after they spend some time there. It's never really explained how they turn into donkeys, but hey, that's Disney magic for ya. The closest thing to Pleasure Isle in Del Toro's Pinocchio is the circus, where Pinocchio is allowed to have as many sweets as he wants. But the real place Pinocchio gets sent off to is a youth camp for to-be soldiers. Yeah, nowhere near as fun as Pleasure Isle. It makes sense since the film takes place during World War II. Pinocchio doesn't turn into a donkey, but he's set to become a soldier if he stays. He doesn't though. He eventually escapes the camp through a World War II related explosion. It would all be very action hero-esque if it weren't so tragic. In both films, Gepetto gets stuck in a giant monster whale trying to find Pinocchio. Also in both films, they get the whale to sneeze so they can get out of its stomach. It goes down very differently in Del Toro's version though. In the original Disney film, Pinocchio starts a fire so the smoke can make the whale sneeze, and it works like a charm. This scene in Del Toro's Pinocchio is very different, and it completely utilizes one of the most valuable assets of the whole movie, Pinocchio's nose. Cricket, Pinocchio, Gepetto, and Spazzatura climb to the top of the ship, and Pinocchio lies until his nose is long enough to climb and leave through the blowhole. The whale still sneezes because of all the tickling in its blowhole, but hey, the idea is very innovative of Pinocchio, and it looks super cool on screen. Perhaps one of the biggest surprises of Del Toro's Pinocchio retelling is that Pinocchio never becomes a real boy. Well, he does, but he doesn't. Let me explain. In the Disney original, Pinocchio becomes a human, a flesh and blood real boy. He is a human version of the painted, realistic puppet that Gepetto made. In Del Toro's movie, Pinocchio stays wooden. We, like lots of people, were curious as to how this unpainted wooden Pinocchio would look as a human. Del Toro changes the meaning of real boy though. Since Pinocchio passes on and meets death a few times in the film, becoming a real boy means becoming mortal. Death tells him that if he wants to go back to Earth before time allows him, he'll have to go back as a mortal. His life will end just like any other mortals would. No fancy resurrections. He says yes, and though he's still wooden, he has the mortality of a boy. It was a bold move on Del Toro's part to not truly make Pinocchio a real boy, but it definitely opens up a conversation about what makes someone real. Now we're going to talk about the ending of Del Toro's Pinocchio, so if you have not seen it, you have been warned. Here we go. In Disney's original Pinocchio, Pinocchio becomes a real boy and lives happily ever after with Gepetto, Cleo, and Figaro. He goes to school as a human and lives a happy little life. The ending of Del Toro's Pinocchio is a tearjerker to say the least. Remember that wish Sebastian J. Cricket was offered earlier? Yeah, instead of using it to get a book deal, he uses it to bring Pinocchio back to life after Pinocchio dies, saving everyone from the whale. Pinocchio is still wooden when he goes back to the house with Gepetto, Spazzatura, and Cricket. Where Disney's Pinocchio ends here happily, Del Toro's version goes on to share that Pinocchio stayed with Gepetto until Gepetto passed away. Cricket also stopped moving one day. Pinocchio puts his body in a matchbox and keeps him in his heart, Even Spazzatura passes away and Pinocchio buries him next to Gepetto and Carlo. Then, Pinocchio, alone, walks off into the sunset to continue on living. He may die eventually, but the film leaves it open-ended and makes us all choke on our tears because, we say this with the most respect in the world. What the hell, Guillermo del Toro? So, those are some of the biggest changes we noticed between Guillermo del Toro's Pinocchio and the Disney original. Let us know in the comments if you think the changes worked for the film and listen to your cricket conscience. Subscribe below.